The first thing you notice is not the cold seeping from the stone walls of the chamber, nor the flickering candlelight that makes the shadows dance. It is the smell. A dense, cloying mixture of heated animal fat, wilting floral perfume, and the faint, sour undertone of unwashed human scalp. You are a lady in waiting, and before you sits the Duchess, her eyes closed, her face a mask of weary endurance. This is the third hour of the ritual. The royal coifeur, a man of intense focus, works with silent precision, packing a mixture of beef tallow and lard the pomatum into the foundations of the towering wire frame already fixed to her head. He is not merely styling hair. He is constructing a monument that she will wear for the next month. You see the fine, jeweled scratching stick lying on the vanity table, within her easy reach for the weeks of incessant itching that are to come. The sweet scent of the orange flower powder he is now dusting over the greasy edifice will fade, and the rancid decay will begin its slow, inevitable work. This construction, this symbol of her immense status and power, will become a warm, dark, and foul nest. It is a crown of glory and a crown of filth. This was not a burden for you to bear, but merely to witness. The historical record, however, shows that this private ritual of construction and endurance was central to the public performance of power. So, before we open the official archives, take a moment to add your mark to our own record with a like and subscribe, but only if you're truly committed to examining the evidence, no matter how grim. We invite you to share your thoughts on who you believe to be the most misunderstood figure in history. And now, the preamble is over. Let us turn to the primary sources and begin the slow work of reconstruction. Before we can analyze the parasites and the putrescents, we must first establish a foundational premise. For much of human history, hair was not merely a biological feature. It was a primary visual signifier of power, a living crown that communicated status more directly than any textile or jewel. This conception begins at a fundamental, almost pre-social level. Long, thick, and healthy hair is a biological advertisement of youth, vitality, and good nutrition. A person with such hair was demonstrably a successful organism, possessing the health required for procreation and leadership. In the context of a monarchy, where the ruler's body was synonymous with the health of the state, these biological signals were elevated to matters of political importance. A king with a full head of hair was seen as virile and potent, his reign blessed by divine or natural favor. A queen whose hair was lustrous and abundant was a symbol of dynastic security and fecundity. The biblical account of Samson, whose superhuman strength was directly tied to his uncut hair, is not an isolated myth but a powerful articulation of this deep-seated cultural equation. Hair is life, hair is strength, hair is power. This idea found its most literal political expression in the Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Franks from the 5th to the 8th century. They were known as the reges crinisi, the long-haired kings. Their uncut hair was the absolute and sacred symbol of their authority. It was their crown, grown from their own body, a tangible link to their ancestral power and their divine right to rule. To cut the hair of a Merovingian king was not an act of grooming. It was an act of deposition. It was a political coup, ritually stripping the monarch of his power, his legitimacy, and his very identity as a ruler. When Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, was deposed in 751, his overthrow was finalized by the shearing of his hair and his forced entry into a monastery. The symbolic castration was complete. As societies grew more complex, so too did this language of hair. The raw biological symbolism of length and health evolved into a more nuanced display of socio-economic dominance. An elaborate hairstyle, one that required hours or even days to create and maintain, became a powerful statement of leisure and wealth. It declared that the wearer did not engage in physical labor. More importantly, it demonstrated that the wearer commanded the resources to employ a team of specialists, maids, hairdressers, and artisans, and to purchase expensive and often rare materials. The towering coiffures of the 18th century French court were not just fashion. They were built from costly wire frames, pads of wool and horsehair, and held together with expensive pomatums made from bear grease or beef marrow. They were then whitened with pounds of finely milled starch or wheat flour, a conspicuous consumption of a basic foodstuff in a time when many of the common people faced starvation. To wear such a structure on one's head was to broadcast, unequivocally, that you possessed a fortune so vast you could afford to waste it on a transient, impractical, and physically burdensome display. Finally, these increasingly artificial hairstyles represented a monarchical attempt to transcend the limitations of nature itself. By constructing hair into architectural forms that defied gravity, weather, and the natural tendencies of the material, the aristocracy was asserting a form of control over the natural world. The head became a canvas for demonstrating human ingenuity and dominance. A hairstyle that could last for weeks, resisting the natural processes of dirt and decay at least superficially, was a statement against mortality and the messiness of biology. It was an effort to transform the human body into a permanent, unchanging work of art, much like the marble statues of antiquity. It was this very ambition, the desire to elevate the human form into a static symbol of power, wealth, and control that set the stage for a catastrophic collision with biological reality. The attempt to create a perfect, unchanging crown of hair would instead create the perfect, thriving ecosystem for vermin, decay the perfect, and disease. This ambition to re-engineer human hair into a stable monument of power was not, however, an invention of the early modern European courts. Its origins can be traced to some of the earliest complex civilizations, where the fundamental tension between symbolic aesthetics and biological reality was already well established. The ancient Egyptians, in particular, provide a stark and meticulously documented case study. The climate of the Nile Valley, hot, dry, and dusty, made long, natural hair a practical liability. It was difficult to keep clean, uncomfortable in the intense heat, and an ideal breeding ground for the ubiquitous head louse, Pediculus humanus capitis. Their solution was both radical and pragmatic. They shaved their heads. Men and women of all social classes, including the pharaohs, regularly removed their natural hair for reasons of comfort and hygiene. A shaved scalp could be easily washed, oiled. Yet, as we have established, a bare head was symbolically inadequate. It communicated nothing of status, power, or divinity. To resolve this paradox, the Egyptians developed the art of wig, making to an extraordinary degree of sophistication. The wig, or shendi-et, became a detachable crown, an artificial head of hair that could be worn for public and ceremonial functions and removed for comfort and cleaning in private. This separation of the symbolic from the biological was, in theory, a perfect solution. In practice, it introduced a new set of hygienic challenges. The finest wigs were grafted from human hair, painstakingly woven strand by strand onto a mesh cap made of netting. For the less affluent, wigs were constructed from more accessible materials, such as sheep swallow plant fibers like flax and palm. To style these wigs into the intricate braids, curls, and geometric shapes favored by Egyptian fashion, a binding agent was required. The primary adhesive used was a mixture of beeswax and resin. This sticky compound was effective at holding the style, but it was also a magnet for dust and dirt. More critically, these elaborate wigs, while detachable, were not immune to infestation. Archaeological evidence is unequivocal on this point. Wigs recovered from ancient tombs, preserved for millennia by the arid climate, have been found to contain the desiccated remains of head lice and, more commonly, their eggs or nits. These tiny nits, cemented to the hair shafts with an insect-produced glue, provide a permanent record of infestation. The Egyptians were acutely aware of this problem. Their tombs are frequently furnished with finely crafted combs, often made of wood or ivory, with two sets of teeth. One side with widely spaced teeth for detangling, and the other with densely packed, fine teeth specifically designed for the removal of lice and nits. The existence of these tools is a testament to a constant, ongoing battle against the parasites that found a welcoming home in their ornate headdresses. They had solved the problem of scalp hygiene by shaving, only to recreate the problem in a removable, external form. This dynamic was mirrored centuries later in the Roman Empire. Roman culture, heavily influenced by its Greek predecessors and its Egyptian conquests, placed an enormous emphasis on personal appearance as an indicator of social standing. For a Roman noblewoman or matrone, her hairstyle was a public declaration of her family's wealth, her husband's status, and her own adherence to the prevailing moral and aesthetic standards. During the Flavian dynasty in the late 1st century AD, female hairstyles became particularly elaborate, rising in towering tiers of curls and braids built upon wireframes and pads. Creating these styles required hours of work from specialized slaves known as ornate races, who used tools like the columistrum, a hollow bronze cylinder that was heated in coals and used as a curling iron. As with the Egyptians, wigs known as Galerian hairpieces were essential components of the Roman stylistic arsenal. They were used to add volume to achieve fashionable styles impossible with natural hair alone, and to conceal hair loss, which could be caused by the use of harsh, lead-based dyes. The demand for hair was so great that it became a byproduct of Roman conquest. Blonde hair from the Germanic tribes and reed hair from Gaul were particularly prized, imported to the capital to adorn the heads of Roman elites. The hair on a matron's head could very well be a trophy from a recent military campaign. Roman authors, such as the poet Ovid, wrote extensively about hair, sometimes complaining about the damage these styles inflicted and the constant maintenance they required. While the Romans were famed for their bathing culture, these architectural hairstyles, fixed with oils, gums, and powders, were not designed for frequent washing. Like their Egyptian counterparts, they created a warm, sheltered, and relatively undisturbed environment, susceptible to infestation. The archaeological record from the Roman world is also rich with fine-toothed combs, confirming that they too were engaged in a continuous and often frustrating war against the same microscopic adversaries. The core problem persisted. The more complex in status affirming the hairstyle, the more hospitable it became to parasitic life. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century precipitated not just a political fragmentation but a profound ideological transformation. The classical world celebration of the ornamented human form gave way to a new Christian ethos that viewed the body with suspicion, as a vessel for sin, a source of temptation, and a temporary shell for an eternal soul. Vanity was recast as a vice, and the elaborate, self-glorifying hairstyles of the Roman matron were supplanted by an aesthetic of pious modesty. The focus of a respectable woman's life was to be her spiritual, not her physical condition. This shift in worldview had a direct and dramatic impact on the treatment and perception of hair. It was no longer a stage for public display but a private attribute, one whose symbolic power was now considered dangerous and in need of strict control. This control was codified by theological doctrine, drawing its primary justification from the writings of St. Paul. In his first epistle to the Corinthians, he articulated a framework that would dominate Western thought for over a millennium. A woman's long hair was her glory was to be covered in the presence of God, as a sign of humility and subordination. Uncovered female hair in a sacred context was deemed shameful, an affront to the divine order. This religious imperative was quickly interwoven with social anxieties about female sexuality. Hair was seen as one of a woman's most potent sensual laws, a potential snare for the male gaze that could provoke lustful thoughts and lead men to sin. The figure of Eve, whose temptation led to humanity's fall from grace, loomed large in the medieval imagination. Containing the seductive power of a woman's hair by concealing it from public view was therefore framed as an act of both piety and social responsibility. The physical manifestation of this doctrine was the veil. For married and respectable women throughout the Middle Ages, appearing in public with their hair uncovered became socially and morally unacceptable. A complex vocabulary of head coverings evolved. The W-imple, the cloth draped around the head, neck, and chin. The coif, a close-fitting cap tied under the chin. And the barbette, a linen band that passed from chin to crown. These were not mere accessories. They were essential components of a woman's public uniform. They obscured the hair almost completely, sometimes even framing the face so tightly as to hide the ears and jawline. The hair beneath was often tightly braided or bound in two knots to fit neatly under the coverings, a practice that further restricted its movement and exposure. This centuries-long practice of mandatory concealment created an entirely new set of biological challenges, ironically subverting the very ideal of purity it was meant to uphold. The veiled head became an ideal microenvironment for parasites and disease. The layers of linen or wool trapped heat and moisture, creating a warm, humid, and dark space directly against the scalp. This was a perfect incubator. The tightly bound hair prevented air from circulating and sweat from evaporating, leading to a perpetual state of dampness. The accumulation of sweat and sebum, the natural oils produced by the scalp, created a nutrient-rich film. This environment was exceptionally hospitable to Pediculus humanoscapitis, the head louse. Sheltered from light disturbance and the desiccating effects of open air, lice could thrive. They had a stable temperature, ample moisture, and an uninterrupted food supply from the scalp. Then it could be cemented to the hair shafts, hidden deep within the braids and under the fabric, making them nearly impossible to remove without undoing the entire structure. The consequences extended beyond parasitic infestation. The same conditions that favored lice also encouraged the growth of fungi and bacteria. Tinea capitis, commonly known as scalp ringworm, was a persistent problem, leading to itchy, scaly patches and hair loss. Bacterial infections of the hair follicles, or folliculatis, could result in painful pustules and sores. The general difficulty of washing and, more importantly, thoroughly drying hair that was kept constantly covered meant that cleanliness was a significant challenge. Medieval medical texts and household manuals contain various recipes for herbal infusions and powders meant to combat vermin of the head and soothe itching scalps, indicating a widespread and persistent problem. Fine-toothed combs made of bone, wood, or ivory remain one of the most common personal artifacts found in medieval archaeological digs, a silent testament to the unending battle being waged beneath the veil. Thus, an institution designed to enforce spiritual purity and social modesty had the paradoxical effect of cultivating a hidden world of physical impurity and infestation. The veil, the ultimate symbol of piety, often concealed a reality that was anything but pure. The rigid, pietistic framework that had kept female hair under wraps for a millennium began to fracture with the dawn of the Renaissance in 14th century Italy. This was not merely a change in fashion, but the external manifestation of a seismic shift in human consciousness. The rediscovery of classical texts, the rise of humanism, and the accumulation of vast mercantile wealth in city-states like Florence and Venice fostered a new worldview. From collective salvation to individual achievement, the human form, long denigrated as a vessel of sin, was reconceptualized and celebrated as a subject of beauty, a mirror of divine harmony, and a canvas for expressing personal and familial power. The body, and by extension the hair, was liberated from its theological prison and brought back into the secular light of public display. In the courts of the Italian Renaissance, female hair once again became a medium for artistry and the decoration of status. The ideal of beauty inspired by classical sculptures and the poetry of Petrarch was one of refined, almost otherworldly elegance. Hairstyles were complex and meticulously structured, designed to showcase a high, noble forehead, a feature considered a sign of intelligence and aristocracy. To achieve this look, women would often pluck or shave their hairline, pushing them back by an inch or more to create a desirable domed shape. The remaining hair was then subjected to elaborate arrangements of braids, twists, and knots, often woven with pearls, silk ribbons, and fine gold threads known as fili d'oro. These styles, immortalized in the portraits of artists like Botticelli and Ghirlandaio, were not designed for practicality but for pure aesthetic effect. They were living sculptures. This return to vanity, however, did not coincide with an advance in hygiene. The materials used to construct and maintain these styles were often sticky and perishable. To set complex braids and hold delicate curls in place, hairdressers relied on viscous setting agents derived from plant gums, quince seeds boiled in water, or simple sugar solutions. While effective, these substances created a tacky surface that attracted dust and dirt. Furthermore, the fashionable hair color of the era, particularly in Venice, was a light, sun-bleached blonde. To achieve this, women would coat their hair in corrosive bleaching concoctions, mixtures of alum, black sulfur, and honey, or acidic solutions of lemon juice and rhubarb root, and then sit for hours in the sun on their balconies wearing a solana, a crownless hat that exposed the hair to the sun while shading the face. This process was damaging to the hair shaft, and the sticky applications only compounded the problem of cleanliness. The war on vermin continued, but the battlefield was now open to public view. Intricate, jewel-encrusted combs were still essential tools, used for both styling and the grim necessity of delicizing. This new aesthetic born in the wealthy courts of Italy, soon found its most potent political expression in the northern monarchies, particularly in England under the Tudor dynasty. The ultimate embodiment of this trend was Queen Elizabeth I. For Elizabeth, appearance was not a matter of personal vanity. It was an instrument of statecraft. As an unmarried female monarch in a world of powerful kings, she cultivated a public image of almost supernatural authority, the Virgin Queen, a semi-divine figure married to her kingdom. Her hairstyle was a central component of this carefully constructed persona. Her naturally red hair was styled in a tight, intricate arrangement of curls and puffs, built up over pads and wire frames to create an iconic, halo-like effect. The plucked high forehead was essential, and her hair was frequently adorned with an extravagant number of pearls and jewels, symbols of her wealth and purity. This image, so powerful in portraits and public appearances, was a laborious and biologically costly artifice. As she aged and her natural hair thinned, Elizabeth came to rely almost repulsively on wigs, reportedly owning over 80 of them, in various shades of red and auburn. These wigs allowed for a consistency of image that her natural hair could no longer provide, but they were heavy, hot, and, like the elaborate styles they mimicked, extremely difficult to keep clean. The Queen's famous aversion to bathing is a matter of record. She was said to have taken a full bath only once a month, whether she needed it or no. One can infer that her scalp and wigs received even less frequent attention. They were managed not with water, but with powders and perfumes intended to absorb grease and mask odors. This reliance on dry, absorbent powders, combined with the structural complexity of the wig and the lack of regular washing, recreated the same fundamental conditions of a dull, sheltered and nutrient-rich environment that had plagued the medieval Vale. The return to vanity was complete. Hair was once again a crown of power, but the stage was now set for this crown to become something far more dangerous. A repository for not just parasites but poisons. The poisons were not merely an incidental byproduct of these elaborate cosmetic practices. They were a central and celebrated ingredient. The iconic image of the Tudor and Elizabethan court, the stark white face, the vividly colored lips, the unnaturally bright hair was an aesthetic built upon a foundation of heavy metals and neurotoxins. The pursuit of this artificial ideal of beauty required a daily engagement with substances that were slowly, methodically destroying the bodies of those who used them. This chemical warfare was waged most intensely upon the skin, but its consequences inevitably extended to the hair and scalp, creating a new and far more insidious set of biological hazards. The cornerstone of this toxic aesthetic was a cosmetic known as Venetian cereus, or the spirits of Saturn. It was a skin-whitening paste made by corroming lead plates with vinegar vapor, then scraping off the resulting white powder, lead carbonate. This powder was mixed with water, vinegar, or egg whites to create a thick, paint-like substance that was applied in layers to the face, neck, and chest. Its purpose was twofold. It conferred the deathly pallor that was the ultimate signifier of aristocracy. A white, unblemished complexion was a clear statement that one did not labor outdoors under the sun. It was a mask of pure leisure. Second, cereus was remarkably effective at concealing imperfections. For Queen Elizabeth, who had been scarred by a severe bout of smallpox in 1562, it was a way to restore the public image of flawless, semi-divine perfection. She applied it so thickly that courtiers described her face as a mask of youth. The problem was that lead carbonate is a potent, cumulative poison. Applied directly to the skin, its acidic base slowly corroded the epidermis, causing blemishes, skin discoloration, and scarring. This damage created a vicious cycle. The more the cereus damaged the skin, the more cereus was needed to conceal the damage. But the effects were more than skin deep. The lead was absorbed through the pores into the bloodstream, leading to systemic poisoning. The documented symptoms of chronic lead exposure align perfectly with the ailments that afflicted many aristocratic women of the period. Severe digestive problems, peripheral nerve damage, loss of appetite, and significant mood changes, including depression and irritability. One of the most visible effects was on the hair. The cereus, applied right up to the hairline, would cause the hair at the temples and forehead to fall out. This autogrotenic alopecia ironically reinforced the fashionable, high forehead, creating a physical reality that mirrored the aesthetic ideal, even as it signaled a body in chemical distress. Use was not the only poison in the courtier's cosmetic arsenal. To create the fashionable bright red lips and rosy cheeks that contrasted so vividly with the white skin, a pigment called vermilion was used. Vermilion is mercury sulfide. Mercury, another heavy metal, is a powerful neurotoxin. Absorbed through the skin of the lips or inhaled as a fine powder, it could cause kidney failure and severe dental problems, including the loosening and loss of teeth. Other preparations aimed at lightening the skin or clearing blemishes contained arsenic, a well-known poison, or sublimate of mercury. To create the wide-eyed, alluring gaze seen in portraits, women used eye drops made from a drop of belladonna or deadly nightshade. The atropine in the plant dilates the pupils, but its regular use could lead to blurred vision, heart palpitations, and eventual blindness. These substances created a toxic ecosystem on the surface of the body. The lack of regular bathing meant these layers of lead, mercury, and arsenic could remain on the skin and in the hair for days or even weeks at a time, slowly seeping into the system. The powders would flake from the face into the wigs and natural hair, adding a layer of toxic dust to the existing mixture of grease, sweat, and parasites. Any lice or fleas inhabiting this environment would be living in and feeding from a chemically saturated host. While some historical accounts suggest these toxins may have had the secondary effect of killing some parasites, it was a negligible benefit in the face of the profound damage being done to the human wearer. The Elizabethan court, in its pursuit of a static, perfect, and powerful image, had embraced a form of slow, self-inflicted poisoning. They had mastered the chemical artifice of beauty, setting a precedent for bodily intervention that would be taken up and transformed by the architects of the following century. The focus would now shift from the chemical composition of the face to the physical structure of the hair itself. As the 17th century dawned, the center of European fashion and power migrated from the Tudor court of England to the burgeoning absolutism of Bourbon France. With this geographical shift came a fundamental change in the aesthetics of power. The Elizabethan ideal, with its focus on the static, icon-like perfection of the face through chemical means, gave way to the Baroque celebration of dynamism, grandeur, and theatricality. But an explosion of physical volume. This change was most dramatically expressed in hair, which began to move away from the head in a way that was less organic and more architectural. The era of building had begun. This trend, paradoxically, was initiated not by women, but by men. King Louis XVI of France began to lose his hair in his early 20s, a potential crisis for a monarch whose virility. To conceal his premature baldness, he began wearing a wig or peruke around 1624. His decision instantly legitimized the practice for men at the highest echelon of society. What began as a practical solution was transformed into an ideological statement by his son and successor, Louis XVI, the Sun King. For Louis XVI, the wig was not a tool of concealment but a primary instrument of power. He adopted the full-bottomed periwig, a massive, shoulder-length cascade of curls that framed the face and fell down the back and chest. Crafted from enormous quantities of human hair, these wigs were fantastically expensive, incredibly heavy, and required constant maintenance by a specialized craftsman, the perruquier. The wig exaggerated the monarch's physical presence, gave him a leonine, almost godlike appearance, and broadcasted his immense wealth and authority. It was a crown of hair, but one that was entirely artificial, demonstrating a mastery over nature that mirrored his absolute control over the state. The women of the court were compelled to respond to this new masculine ideal of verticulating volume. For much of the mid-17th century, female hairstyles were comparatively modest, often featuring horizontal arrangements of curls around the face. But by the 1682, a new fashion emerged that would dramatically alter the female silhouette. The style was known as the fontange, and its origin is attributed to a serendipitous moment during a royal hunt. Holds that Marie-Angélique Lice, the Duchesse de Fontanges and a mistress of the king, had her hair blown into disarray. She improvisation tied it up on top of her head using a garter. The king was reportedly charmed by the youthful, informal look, and the next day, every woman at court appeared with her hair piled high in a similar fashion. This simple, practical gesture was immediately seized upon and transformed by the relentless engine of courtly competition. The fontaine rapidly evolved from a simple top knot into a complex, towering structure. It was no longer a hairstyle in the traditional sense, but a headdress built upon the hair. The core of this structure was a wire foundation known as a commode. This scaffolding, which could reach a foot or more in height, was fixed to the head. Along with false hairpieces was arranged in curls and puffs. But the hair itself was often a secondary element. The primary components of the fontaine were years of pleated and starched lace, ribbons, and other decorative fabrics, arranged vertically on the wire frame. It was a multi-story edifice of linen and silk, perched precariously atop the head. Maintaining such a structure was a significant challenge. The fabric components were stiffened with starch, and the entire assembly was held together with a multitude of pins. It was rigid, uncomfortable, and utterly impractical. Women had to stoop to pass through doorways and were said to have difficulty sleeping, sometimes resorting to propping their heads up with pillows to avoid crushing the delicate construction. Like its predecessors, the fontaine was a fortress against cleanliness. It was not designed to be disassembled daily. The area beneath the wire frame and the tightly bound hair became a familiar haven for trapped sweat, oils, and, inevitably, lice. The starched linen ribbons offered yet more surfaces for parasites to cling to and lay their eggs. The architectural shift was complete. Hair was no longer something to be styled. It was something upon which to build. The Baroque era, with its masculine wigs and feminine hours of lace, had laid the structural and ideological groundwork for the even more extreme creations of the century to come. It had established the principle that the most fashionable head was not one adorned with beautiful hair, but one capable of supporting the most complex and gravity-defying edifice. To understand the biological consequences of the pouf, one must first dissect its anatomy. It was not a hairstyle in the modern sense of shaping natural hair, but a composite sculpture assembled directly onto the head of the wearer. The process began with the wearer's own hair, which served not as the main event, but as the foundational anchor and the final, superficial layer of concealment. This natural hair was meticulously divided and often saturated with a greasy pomade to make it pliable and adhesive. A significant portion was set aside, destined to be combed up and over the finished structure to provide a veneer of authenticity. The core of the pouf was its internal armature, a load-bearing skeleton designed to provide the necessary height and shape. This was typically a cage-like frame made of thin iron wire, known in French as fils de fer. These frames could be shaped into crescents, globes, or cones, depending on the desired silhouette. The frame was placed on the crown of the head and securely tied down with ribbons or tapes, which were then anchored to the underlying natural hair. This wire skeleton was the first source of physical distress, its weight and pressure points often causing headaches and scalp soreness. This skeleton, however, was insufficient to create the massive volume required. It needed to be fleshed out, and this was accomplished with a variety of padding materials. The most common were arch cushions, pads, or rollers called coussinets or cale-pitches. These were crescent-shaped or sausage-like form stuffed with a range of materials. For the wealthy, the filling might be soft wool or fine lasmol. For those of more modest, yet still aspirational, means, the stuffing could be horsehair, goat hair, or even plant fibers such as moss, bran, or sawdust. These pads were arranged and stitched onto the wire frame and pinned directly into the wearer's natural hair, creating a solid, absorbent mass that gave the pouf its fundamental shape. This layer of padding was the structure's soft tissue, and it would prove to be a critical component in the undisturbed ecosystem that was to follow, capable of soaking up and retaining sweat, sebum, and any external moisture. With the armature and padding in place, the construction entered its final and most visible phase. The application of the hair itself. The wearer's own hair was almost never sufficient in volume or length to cover such a large structure. Consequently, enormous quantities of false hair were required. This hair came from a variety of sources. The most prized was, of course, human hair, purchased from peasants, cut from novices entering convents, or sometimes even salvaged from the bodies of the dead. When human hair was too expensive, treated horse hair or goat hair was used as a substitute. This false hair, often pre-curled, dyed, and arranged into long switches or wefts, was then meticulously layered over the padded frame. It was pinned, sewn, and woven into place by the coiffeur, who acted less as a stylist and more as a combination of upholsterer and sculptor. Finally, the wearer's own reserved hair was combed up from the sides and back, its greased strands carefully blended over the false hair to mask the seams and create the illusion of a single, impossibly voluminous mass of natural growth. The construction could extend 2 or even 3 feet above the crown, a precarious tower of wire padding, and both human and animal hair. This complex multi-layered structure of metal, textile, and keratin was now complete in its form, but it was still just an assembly of disparate parts. It lacked cohesion. To unify the surface, to bind the real hair to the false, and to prepare the entire edifice for its final whitening, a crucial binding agent was needed. This was not a simple hairspray or gel, but a thick organic mortar that would serve as the biological cement for the entire creation. The organic mortar that served as the biological cement for these towering hair sculptures was known as pomatum or pomade. The term derives from the Latin word for apple. Pomama's early recipes often incorporated the pulp of apples for their scent. By the 18th century, however, this simple formulation had evolved into a complex and highly varied substance, but its core ingredient remained constant: rendered animal fat. This was the foundational substrate, the sticky, pliable medium that gave the coiffeur control over the hair, allowing it to be sculpted, shaped, and, most importantly, adhered to the underlying structure of pads and wires. The selection of fat was itself a marker of class. The most exclusive and costly pomatums were made from the rendered fat of a bear, prized for its supposed ability to promote hair growth. More common, but still high quality, preparations used purified pork lard, beef or mutton tallow, or beef bone marrow. The production of this pomatum was a craft in itself. The raw fat was carefully rendered, melted down and clarified to remove impurities and solids. This process, known as clarification, was crucial for reducing the initial, strong animal odor. The resulting clean fat was then often mixed with a stabilizing agent, such as beeswax or spermus eti, a waxy substance, harvested from the head cavity of the sperm whale to give it a firmer consistency and a higher melting point, preventing it from liquefying on dripping in a warm ballroom. The final stage was scenting, to mask the lingering fatty smell and to imbue the hair with a fashionable fragrance. The warm fat was infused with a variety of expensive aromatic ingredients. These could include the essential oils of flowers like jasmine, rose, or tuberose, spices such as cloves and cinnamon, or citrus essences like bergamot and orange. Ready to be applied by the handful. The application was not a delicate affair. The coiffeur would take a generous amount of the pomatum and work it methodically through the hair, from root to tip, ensuring every strand was coated. This greasy layer served multiple purposes. It provided the necessary tackiness to make the hair stick to the pads and to itself, holding curls and puffs in place far more effectively than pins alone. It gave the hair a slight sheen, which was considered desirable before the final powdering, and it created an occlusive, water-resistant layer, which was key to the style's longevity. Once applied, the pomatum effectively sealed the hair against the outside world. This very longevity, however, was the genesis of its downfall. The animal fat in the pomatum was an organic, perishable substance. From the moment it was warmed by the heat of the human scalp and exposed to the air, it began a slow, inexorable process of decomposition. This process, known as rancidification, occurs through two primary chemical pathways. Oxidation and hydromatum are exposed to oxygen, a reaction accelerated by the body's natural warmth. This breaks down the fats into volatile aldehydes and ketones, compounds notorious for their sharp, unpleasant odors. Hydrolysis, meanwhile, is driven by the action of microbes, bacteria and fungi present on the skin and in the environment, which break down the fats into free fatty acids, such as butyric acid, which has the characteristic sour smell of spoiled butter. The scalp, trapped beneath the unreachable fortress of pads, hair, and pomatum, became a perfect incubator. The constant body heat maintained an optimal temperature for microbial growth. The pomatum itself provided an abundant, high-energy food source. Sweat and sebum produced by the scalp added moisture and further nutrients to the mixture. Within a matter of days, the delicate floral or citrus scent of the freshly applied pomatum would begin to fade, replaced by a new, more pungent aroma. It might be a slightly sour or musty smell. But as the weeks wore on and the layers of grease, trapped skin cells, and accumulated dust continued to fester, the scent would intensify, becoming a deeply unpleasant, acrid odor of decay. This was the smell of rotting fat, a biological reality that no amount of perfume could entirely conquer. This rancid, nutrient-rich paste was more than just foul-smelling. It transformed the entire hairdo into a baited trap, a welcoming feast for any creature small enough to make its home there. The foundation had been laid and had begun to rot. The next step was to cover the decay with a pristine, white layer of dust. The construction was now a sticky, dense, and increasingly fragrant mass of human hair, animal hair, wool padding, and decomposing animal fat. In its current state, it was a biological hazard masquerading as a hairstyle. But its transformation was not yet complete. The final step was required to transmute this organic sculpture from a greasy, multi-toned object into a pristine, homogeneous symbol of aristocratic refinement. This final act was the application of hair powder, a process that created a stark white or pastel-colored veneer, concealing the chaos beneath and, for a short time, waging an olfactory battle against the encroaching scent of decay. The practice of powdering the hair served several critical functions. Aesthetically, it was the ultimate mark of artificial and leisure. A powdered head was visibly and undeniably a work of artifice, signaling that its owner was so far removed from the world of labor that they could afford to render a part of their body functionally decorative. It also served to unify the disparate elements of the pouf. The wearer's natural hair, the horsehair switches, and the wool pads were all different colors and textures. The thick blanket of powder erased these inconsistencies, creating a single, uniform, sculptural surface, much like a gesso primer on a canvas or the final white finish on a marble statue. This monochrome or pastel finish was the height of fashion, a stark contrast to the natural hair colors associated with the lower classes. Practically, the powder was a palliative measure, a primitive form of dry shampoo. The primary ingredient in most hair powders was a finely milled starch. High-quality powders were made from wheat or rice starch, while less expensive versions used potato flour or even pulverized minerals like alabaster or plaster of Paris. This starchy dust was highly absorbent. When applied to the pomatum-laden hair, it soaked up some of the surface grease, reducing the unpleasantly slick appearance and providing a matte finish. More importantly, the powder was heavily scented. It was infused with expensive fragrances like powdered orris root, lavender, violet, or jasmine. The application of the scented powder was a desperate attempt to mask the underlying odor of the rancid, ifying pomatum. For the first few days, this fragrant cloud might succeed in overpowering the sour notes of decay, but it was a temporary victory. The powder would soon become saturated with grease and sweat, its pleasant scent mingling with and ultimately being subsumed by the more powerful biological odors emanating from the scalp. The application of this powder was a messy, industrial-scale process. It could not be done in a well-appointed room, as the fine dust would settle on them during the furniture and fabrics. Aristocratic homes often had a dedicated powdering closet, a small room that could be easily cleaned. The individual being powdered would wear a special gown, known as a powdering mantle, to protect their clothes, to protect their face and prevent them from inhaling the dense cloud of starch. They would hold a cone-shaped mask, typically made of paper or glass, over their eyes, nose and mouth. The co-IFFEUR would then apply the powder using a variety of tools: a large brush, a soft pad, or, for maximum coverage, a set of bellows. A thick white cloud would erupt, enveloping the client's head and filling the small room. The excess powder was then brushed off, leaving a thick, compacted layer adhering to the greasy pomatum. This final, pristine white layer, however, introduced a catastrophic new element into the hair's ecosystem. The pomatum, for all its foulness, was primarily a fat. The powder, on the other hand, was a carbohydrate. By dusting their rancid, fat-based headdresses with pounds of edible flour. The aristocracy was, in essence, seasoning their creation. They had inadvertently completed the formula for a perfect mobile habitat for vermin. The pomatum and the natural scalp oils provided fats and proteins, and now the powder provided an abundant, easily accessible source of carbohydrates. The head had become a fully stocked pantry, a welcoming environment offering a balanced diet for any creature that might find its way there. The pristine white surface, intended to signify purity and refinement, was in fact a baited invitation. The monument to aristocratic power was now complete, and it was ready to be inhabited. The baited invitation extended by these powdered and pommade structures was not left unanswered for long. The completed pouf, a warm, dark, and nutrient-rich edifice, rapidly transitioned from an inanimate object of fashion into a teeming, mobile ecosystem. A unique and horrifying funnel niche had been created, and nature, in its relentless opportunism, wasted no time in colonizing it. The wearers of these headdresses were not merely individuals, they were hosts, carrying upon their heads a thriving biome of decay and infestation. The primary and most ubiquitous colonist was the head louse, Pediculus humanus capitis. This parasite was already a familiar, albeit unwelcome, companion to humanity, but the environment of the pouf allowed its population to flourish on an unprecedented scale. The life cycle of the louse was perfectly accommodated. The constant warmth radiating from the scalp provided an ideal incubation temperature for its eggs, or nits. A female louse could lay several eggs a day, cementing each one to an individual hair shaft with a powerful, washable head of hair. Regular combing and cleaning could disrupt this cycle. But within the pouf, these nits were laid in the deepest, most inaccessible recesses of the structure, sealed under layers of pomatum and false hair, utterly shielded from any grooming tool. Once hatched, the louse nymphs had immediate access to their sole food source, human blood, which they obtained by piercing the scalp. The dense padding and matted hair provided them with perfect cover from disturbance. The greasy pomatum, far from being a deterrent, acted as a protective layer, gumming up the teeth of any comb that might attempt to penetrate the mass and making the parasites difficult to dislodge. The parasitic load on a single individual could become immense, numbering not in the dozens, but in the hundreds or even thousands. The constant feeding by this vast population would lead to a perpetual, maddening itch, the body's inflammatory response to the anticoagulate saliva injected by the lice with each bite. Sharing this habitat was a second, more mobile parasite, the human flea, Pulex irritans. Unlike lice, which spend their entire lives on their host, fleas can jump and live for periods in bedding or furniture. However, the pouf was such an ideal nesting site that it could sustain a permanent population. The wool and horsehair padding of the cussiness were analogous to a fabric nest, providing a perfect environment for fleas to lay their eggs. The larvae would then hatch into the padding, feeding on organic detritus, which was in abundant supply in the form of shed skin cells and the feces of the lice. Once they reached adulthood, the fleas had a captive food source in the scalp just inches away. Their bites, which often appeared in clusters, added another layer of painful, itchy irritation to the host's experience. It is, however, the third and most notorious resident of the headdress that truly captures the horror of this sartorial ecosystem. The mouse. While the image of mice nesting in a woman's hair seems like a grotesque caricature, it is an accusation rooted in the plausible reality of the environment. Contemporary satirical cartoons frequently depicted scenes of tiny animals, including mice, living within the massive coiffures. While likely an exaggeration of a common occurrence, the possibility was far from zero. A small house or field mouse, attracted by the powerful smell of decomposing fat and edible flour, could easily scale a woman's clothing or bed curtains while she slept. Upon reaching the head, it would discover a pre-built nest warm, dark, sheltered, and stocked with a food supply of starch and fatty pomade. The wire frame and dense padding would provide a ready-made burrow. While it is unlikely that a mouse would be a permanent resident in the way lice were, it is entirely conceivable that one could take up temporary shelter, feed on the provisions, and raise a litter within the cavernous structure, all known to the sleeping host until the telltale scratching and scurrying began. The cumulative effect of this infestation was a state of constant physical misery. the scalp would be covered in a mass of bites, sores from scratching, and a general inflammation. The incessant itching was a torment that could not be relieved without destroying the fantastically expensive and time-consuming hairstyle. The wearer was trapped, forced to endure a living, crawling crown as the price of her social standing. This was not a secret shame. It was a widely acknowledged, if seldom discussed, reality of aristocratic life. The problem was so universal that it necessitated the invention of a new class of tool, one designed not to remove the cause of the problem, but merely to manage its most unbearable symptom. The relentless, parasitic activity deep within the warm confines of the pouf produced one dominant and inescapable consequence for its host: a profound and unceasing itch. This was not a minor annoyance, but a form of low-grade chronic torture. The medical term for this sensation is pruritus, and it is one of the most powerful sensory signals the human body can generate, a primal command to scratch and remove a potential threat from the skin's surface. The wearer of an infested coiffure was thus presented with an intractable dilemma. To obey this primal command and scratch with her fingernails was to commit an act of catastrophic vandalism. The slightest disturbance could dislodge a curl, create a visible furrow in the powdered surface, or even compromise the structural integrity of the entire edifice. Given that the hairstyle was a masterpiece of artifice that had cost a small fortune and taken a full day to create, such an act was unthinkable. The dilemma therefore required an engineered solution. If the hand could not be used, a proxy would have to be invented, a tool that could navigate the complex internal architecture of the headdress and deliver targeted relief to the scalp without causing any external damage. The result was the scratching stick, a device that stands as one of the most eloquent and bizarre artifacts of the period. In France, it was known as a jewel-encrusted back scratcher, though its primary use was for the head. It was a specialized instrument, born from the unique union of high fashion and pure hygiene. In its basic form, the scratching stick was a long, slender rod, typically between 12 and 18 inches in length. This length was a functional necessity, providing the reach required to penetrate the depths of the pouf from various angles. The rod itself was crafted from materials befitting an aristocratic accessory. The finest examples were turned from ivory, ebony, tortoiseshell, or mother of pearl. Solid silver and even gold-plated versions were not uncommon. The true artistry, however, was reserved for the business end of the tool. This was most often carved into the shape of a diminutive, elegantly articulated human hand, complete with delicate fingers and carefully rendered fingernails. The choice of a hand was a piece of sophisticated, almost ironic, design. It was a literal, artificial substitute for the wearer's own forbidden hand. In other variations, the end might be shaped like a bird's claw, a rake, or a simple, serrated fork. The key was that the scratching surface was fine enough to provide relief but smooth and small enough to not snag on the hair pads or wire frame. Crucially, the scratching stick was not a hidden object of shame, to be used only in the privacy of one's chambers. It was a public accessory, a part of a fashionable lady's formal equipage. It was carried openly, often hung from a belt or chatelaine alongside other essential implements like a fan, a watch, or a vinaigrette for smelling salts. Its status as a luxury good, crafted by jewelers and artisans, completely normalized its function. To produce a silver and ivory scratching stick in a crowded ballroom and delicately inserted into one's towering coiffure was not an admission of a squalid secret. On the contrary, it was a subtle performance of aristocratic nonchalance, an elegant solution to a universally understood inconvenience. It signaled that one was so dedicated to the high-maintenance rigors of fashion that one required a specialized, beautiful tool to manage its side effects. The very existence of this tool, however, reveals a deeper truth about the period's priorities. It is essential to distinguish the scratching stick from another common tool. The comb was an instrument of eradication. Its purpose was to remove the source of the problem. The scratching stick was an instrument of appeasement. It was designed to coexist with the problem, to make the infestation bearable rather than to eliminate it, meant to pacify the irritated scalp without disturbing the parasite's habitat. The choice to carry a scratching stick instead of relentlessly using a comb was a tacit admission of defeat, or more accurately a conscious decision that the preservation of the external form was more important than the achievement of internal cleanliness. The integrity of the powdered, pomade sculpture took precedence over the biological integrity of the body beneath. The ornate scratching stick was the ultimate symbol of this compromise, a beautiful tool designed to manage the symptoms of a beautiful, but slowly rotting crown. The ornate scratching stick, as an instrument of management rather than eradication, directly answers the question of how an individual endured an infested coiffure. It does not, however, address the more fundamental question of why this endurance was necessary. Why not simply solve the problem at its source with a thorough washing? The answer lies in the collision between the pre-industrial world's limited technology and the hairstyle's complex, multi-material composition. The pouf was not merely difficult to wash. It was, by its very design and the context in which it existed, functionally unwashable. Its construction was a fortress built expressly to resist the intrusion of water, rendering cleanliness a logistical impossibility. First, one must consider the sheer effort required to procure heated water in an 18th century aristocratic household. The modern convenience of instant, limitless hot water from a tap did not exist. Every drop had to be hauled by servants, often from an external well, carried in buckets to the kitchens, heated in large cauldrons over a wood or coal fire, and then transported again to the chambers where it would be used. This was an immense expenditure of labor and fuel. A full bath was a major, infrequent event. The idea of undertaking such a process simply to wash one's hair was, for most, a profligate waste of resources, reserved for the direst necessity. Even if the resources were available, the application of water to the pouf would have been an act of immediate and irreversible destruction. The structure's primary binding agent, the pomatum, was a water-resistant animal fat. Cold or lukewarm water would have had little effect, failing to penetrate the greasy layers. Hot water, necessary to melt the fat, would have created a far greater pomatum into a foul-smelling, greasy slurry, which would then soak deeply into the absorbed wool and horsehair padding of the underlying cushions. Simultaneously, the water would react with the thick layer of starch-based powder, transforming it from a dry dust into a thick, gluey, dough-like paste. This paste would instantly make the hair both reel and false into intractable clumps, binding it to the greasy, waterlogged padding beneath. The result would be a catastrophic structural failure. The entire coiffure would collapse into a single dense, sodden mass of unimaginable filth. It would be less like washing hair and more like attempting to clean a grease-soaked, flour-caked sponge. And assuming one could somehow endure this process, the structure would now be saturated with water, its weight increasing exponentially. The delicate iron wires of the internal frame, now exposed to prolonged dampness, would begin to rust, potentially staining the hair and weakening the frame itself. The greatest logistical challenge, however, would be the drying process. In the absence of any form of artificial drying technology beyond the hearth, the only option was evaporation. Drying this dense, waterlogged mass, which was packed tightly against the scalp, would take days, perhaps even a full week. During this extended period, the head would become a walking petri dish. The head would become a walking petri dish. The combination of warmth from the scalp, moisture from the washing, and the rich organic material of the hair, padding, flour paste, and liquefied fat would create the perfect conditions for a population explosion of bacteria, mold, and mildew. The process of anaerobic decomposition would begin, producing an odor far more powerful and offensive than that of the simple rancid pomatum. The hair would literally begin to rot on the head. Therefore, washing was not a viable maintenance strategy. The pouf was conceived as a long-term installation, an investment of time, money, and materials. Its owner expected it to last with minor superficial repairs for weeks, sometimes even over a month. The role of the co-IFFEUR was not just to build the structure, but to return periodically to perform maintenance, a process known as opening the head, which involved patching the powder, readjusting the curls, and attempting some minimal, dry cleaning. Total deconstruction and reconstruction was the only way to truly clean the head, and it was a process undertaken as infrequently as possible. The fortress against cleanliness was absolute. This sealed, festering system produced one unavoidable byproduct that could not be scratched away: an overwhelming and pervasive smell. The unwashable nature of the pouf created a sealed biological system that inevitably produced a potent and pervasive byproduct: odor. The 18th century court, so often depicted in visual art as a realm of pristine silks and powdered perfection, was, in olfactory terms, a battleground. It was a space defined by a constant and desperate war between the exquisite, costly fragrances of the perfumer's art and the raw, inescapable stench of the unwashed human body. At the very epicenter of this personal olfactory crisis was the hair, a towering, slowly composting edifice that acted as a potent, continuous source of malodor. To comprehend the olfactory reality of the court, we must first deconstruct the specific aromatic profile of the coiffeur. It was not a single, simple smell but a complex score of decay. The foundational note was the rancid pomatum. As the animal fats broke down through oxidation and microbial action, they released a host of volatile compounds, most notably aldehydes and ketones. These produced a sharp, acrid, and deeply unpleasant smell, often compared to the scent of stale, sour butter or spoiled meat. Layered upon this was the musty, damp odor of the starch-based powder as it absorbed sweat and sebum, creating a smell reminiscent of old, wet flour. Added to this was the basic scent of stale human sweat, trapped and concentrated under the occlusive layers, which would undergo its own bacterial decomposition, producing a familiar sour, pungent body odor. In cases of severe parasitic infestation or secondary scalp infections, a faint but foul metallic or septic scent could also be present. This personal cloud of odor was not an isolated phenomenon. It was the norm. The general state of hygiene, even among the aristocracy, was profoundly different from modern standards. Full-body bathing was infrequent, laundry practices were laborious, and dental health was often abysmal. The ambient smell in a crowded, poorly ventilated ballroom at Versailles was likely a thick, cloying miasma, reflective body odor, bad breath, and latent sickness, all mingling with the smoke from hundreds of wax candles. In this environment, the stench emanating from a decaying hairstyle was not an outlier but a significant contributor to the overall olfactory pollution. It is no coincidence that the 18th century also represents the golden age of French perfumery. The industry, centered in the town of Grasse, flourished precisely because the demand for powerful scent was insatiable. Perfume was not a subtle, decorative luxury. It was a functional necessity, an essential tool in the daily battle for aromatic supremacy. The fragrances deployed were not the light, ethereal florals of modern perfumery. They needed to be heavy, potent, and tenacious enough to compete with, and hopefully overwhelm, the powerful biological odors they were meant to conceal. Consequently, the most prized ingredients were of animal origin, known as animal Lice notes. These included musk, a secretion from the glands of the Tibetan musk deer; civet, a paste collected from the perineal glands of the civet cat; and ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the digestive system of sperm whales and found floating in the ocean. These substances, while possessing their own strong, complex odors, were valued primarily as fixative. Their chemical structure allowed them to bind with more volatile floral and herbal scents, making the overall fragrance last for many hours. They gave the perfume a powerful, room-filling presence or sillage. A typical aristocratic perfume would be a heavy composition of these animal Lice bases, layered with intense floral absolutes like jasmine, tuberose, and rose, and spiced with cloves, cinnamon, and citrus oils. The application of this fragrant armor was liberal. Perfume was not merely dabbed on pulse points. It was used to drench clothing, fans, gloves, and handkerchiefs. The hair powder itself was heavily scented, adding another layer of fragrance directly onto the head. Small, ornate containers called vinaigrettes, filled with cotton soaked in aromatic vinegar or smelling salts, were carried to be sniffed when an overwhelming external odor was encountered. The goal was to create a personal aromatic bubble, a shield of fragrance to keep the foulness of the world and the self at bay. The result in a crowded room was not a pleasant perfume, but an olfactory cacophony, a dizzying, suffocating blend of competing scents, with heavy floral and animal notes warring against the sour, acrid undertones of decay. To be an aristocrat was to be both a source of undercombatant against this stench, and the individual tasked with managing this fragile, foul-smelling creation was a figure of immense importance. The individual tasked with the creation and maintenance of this fragile, foul-smelling, and socially essential edifice was not a mere servant. He was a highly skilled artisan, a celebrated artist, and a trusted technician who commanded immense fees and, in some cases, international fame. This was the coiffeur, a figure who rose from the anonymous ranks of valets and ladies' maids to become a veritable celebrity in the 18th century. Men like Leonard O'Ty, the personal hairdresser to Marie Antoinette, were not just stylists. They were architects of identity, engineers of status, and in the most private and practical sense, exterminators who managed the biological consequences of their own creations. The role of the coiffeur began as an architect. The construction of a grand pouf was a project undertaken with the same level of consultation and planning as the design of a garden folly or a piece of bespoke furniture. The initial phase was a dialogue between patron and artist. The occasion, a court ball, a wedding, a formal reception, would dictate the theme. The client's face shape, status, and the prevailing micro-trends of the season would inform the proposed height, silhouette, and specific ornamentation. The coiffeur would produce sketches, discuss materials, and establish a budget for the necessary false hair, padding, wire, and decorations. This was a process of bespoke design, requiring a keen understanding of both aesthetic principles and the rigid semiotics of the court. Once the design was approved, the construction phase began, a process that revealed the coiffeur's skills as a structural engineer. He worked not with hairpins and combs alone, but with pliers, wires, unstitching needles. His first task was to build a stable foundation, anchoring the wire armature securely to the client's head in a way that distributed its weight and maintained its balance. This required a practical understanding of physics and a delicate touch to avoid causing immediate pain. He then had to flesh out the skeleton with the cousins, the pads of wool and horsehair, shaping and affixing them to create the desired volume, while ensuring the structure remained as light as possible. Finally came the application of the facade, the meticulous layering of real and false hair over the padding, a process akin to upholstery or plastering, all unified by the liberal application of pomatum. Throughout this process, he had to consider the stresses the structure would endure. The jolting of a carriage ride, the heat of a crowded ballroom, the movements of a formal dance. The finished product had to be not just beautiful but durable. With the structure complete, the coiffeur transitioned from engineer to sculptor. The surface of the pouf became a canvas for elaborate, narrative decoration. This was the era of the thematic coiffure. A lady might wear a powerful belle poule, featuring a model of the French warship that had won a recent victory, complete with masts and rigging. Another might sport a pastoral scene with miniature sheep or a representation of a specific philosophical concept. Ribbons, artificial flowers, and complex models required a sculptor's eye for composition and balance. The final painting of the sculpture with colored or white powder was the last artistic flourish, unifying the disparate elements into a cohesive, if surreal, work of art. The coiffeur's duties, however, did not end when the masterpiece was complete. He was also a maintenance technician, responsible for the upkeep of his creation. This is where the grim reality of his profession diverged sharply from its artistic aspirations. The client would schedule regular appointments, not for a process of repair and fumigation. This procedure, sometimes referred to as overlotet or opening the head, was a delicate and often unpleasant task. The coiffeur would carefully inspect the structure for any signs of collapse or damage, repinning loose sections and reapplying pomatum and powder to the surface. His most critical maintenance task, however, was the management of the resident fauna. He was, in effect, the pest control specialist. This was not achieved through washing, but through a combination of manual and chemical means. Using a long, fine-toothed metal comb, he would carefully attempt to comb out what lice and bits he could reach without disturbing the hairdo's core. For a more aggressive approach, he might apply a vermin powder to the scalp. These powders were often toxic, containing substances like mercury sublimate, lead or arsenic compounds, which could poison the parasites. More benign, but less effective, options included powders made from insect-repelling herbs like stave sec or pyrethrum. The goal was never total eradication that was impossible without complete deconstruction. The goal was control, to keep the parasitic population at a level that was, if not comfortable, at least endurable for the client. The great Go-Infested was therefore a man of profound contradictions. An artist who created breathtaking beauty, and a pragmatist who managed the inevitable rotten infestation that festered at its core. Beyond the biological contradictions managed by the Go-Infested are the delicate balance between aesthetic perfection and parasitic reality. The very materials of his art presented a far more immediate and catastrophic physical threat. The infested, decaying headdress was a slow crisis, a form of chronic misery. But it was also, in its fundamental composition, a highly efficient incendiary device, a perfectly assembled torch waiting patiently for a spot. The same combination of elements that made the powerful welcoming habitat for lice also made it extraordinarily flammable, transforming its wearer into a walking fire hazard in a world illuminated by open flame. The flammability of the structure can be analyzed by dissecting its components, each of which contributed a unique property to its potential for combustion. The most volatile and dangerous element was the hair powder. This fine dust, typically made of wheat or potato starch, is a classic example of a combustible particulate solid. In its loose, airborne state, such as during the application process with bellows, it could create a fuel-air mixture capable of a dust explosion, an extremely rapid combustion event that releases enormous energy in a fraction of a second. Even when compacted onto the hair, the starch powder remained a potent fuel source. It provided a dry, high-surface area material that could ignite with startling speed, carrying a flame across the entire surface of the coiffure almost instantaneously. This powdered surface was bound to the hair with the second key flammable component, the pomatum. The animal fat base of the pomade is a hydrocarbon, chemically similar to the wax in a candle. When exposed to the heat of an approaching flame, the pomatum would first melt, turning from a solid paste into a liquid accelerant. This hot, liquid fat would soak further into the hair and the underlying padding, spreading the fuel. As the temperature rose further, the fat would begin to vaporize, releasing flammable gases. The hair shafts, now saturated in this liquid fat, effectively became thousands of tiny wicks. Once ignited, the pomatum would burn with a hot, persistent, and smoky flame, dripping down onto the wearer's face, neck, and clothing, spreading the fire with terrifying efficiency. Beneath these two primary combustibles lay the core structure, a mass of additional fuel. The false hair, whether human or animal, was made of keratin, a protein that burns readily with a distinct and noxious odor. The internal padding, or cusciness, was often stuffed with highly flammable materials like dried moss, sawdust, or bran. Even the more common wool or horsehair, while slightly more fire-resistant, was smited by the hotter burning fat in powder. The entire edifice was adorned with decorative elements, silk ribbons, dried flowers, feathers, and lace, all of which were themselves highly flammable and would serve as kind. The wire frame, the only non-combustible part, would become a superheated cage, holding the burning mass together and making it impossible to beat out or remove quickly. The world in which this walking pyre moved was saturated with ignition sources. An 18th century ballroom or theatre was not lit by electricity, but by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of wax candles. They burned in massive overhead chandeliers, in wall-mounted sconces often positioned at head height, and were carried by servants on candelabras. A woman wearing a 3-foot-tall headdress had to navigate this environment with extreme care. A moment's inattention while turning, bowing, or passing through a crowded space could bring the top of her powdered coiffure out into contact with an open flame. Carriages were lit with swaying lanterns, corridors were lit by torches. Even the act of reading a letter in one's private chambers required a candle, its flame flickering just inches from the face. The curling irons used by the Go-Infested for maintenance were heated directly in the coals of a fire, presenting another point of potential disaster. Historical accounts and satirical prints of the era are replete with cautionary tales of these head fires. While some may be exaggerated for dramatic effect, they speak to a very real and widely understood fear. An ignition event would be catastrophic and almost instantaneous. The initial flash of the hair powder would engulf the head in a ball of fire. The melting pomatum would then fuel a more sustained, intense blaze. The victim would be trapped, with a burning, melting, and collapsing furnace affixed to her scalp. The tragic death of Madame von Schaufelstein in 1782's Vienna, who reportedly died after her headdress caught fire from a candle during a court event, serves as a grim testament to this ever-present danger. The pouf, the ultimate symbol of a life of leisure and luxury, carried with it the constant, terrifying risk of a sudden and horrific death by fire. While the threat of sudden, fiery immolation represented the most dramatic and acute danger posed by these elaborate coiffures, it was not the most common. For every noble woman who met a spectacular end by fire, thousands more were engaged in a slow grinding war of attrition waged against their own bodies. The true medical legacy of the pouf was not one of sudden trauma, but of chronic disease, a methodical and relentless biological siege that transformed the scalp from healthy tissue into a landscape of perpetual inflammation, infection, and decay. The hairstyle, a public symbol of vitality, was a private catalyst for a host of debilitating and often permanent medical conditions. The primary assault began with the parasites themselves. A significant infestation of head lice, a condition known as pediculosis capitis, is not merely an issue of pruritus or itching. Each louse feeds multiple times a day by piercing the skin and ingesting blood. An individual hosting a population of hundreds or thousands of these insects was therefore subject to thousands of tiny wounds every single day. The body's immune system responds to the anticoagulant proteins in the low user's saliva, triggering the release of histamines and creating the intense, maddening itch. In extreme and prolonged cases, particularly in an individual who was already malnourished, the constant blood loss from a massive louse population could even contribute to iron deficiency anemia. The scalp under this constant parasitic attack existed in a state of continuous low-grade trauma. This trauma was invariably compounded by the host's response. The incessant itching compelled the wearer to scratch, whether with a scratching stick or, in moments of private desperation, with her own fingernails. This action, known as excoriation, created a new set of medical problems. The scratching abraded and broke the surface of the skin, creating open sores and weeping lesions. These breaks in the skin's protective barrier served as an open invitation to pathogenic bacteria. The environment under the pouf, warm, moist, and filled with decaying organic matter, was a thriving culture medium for bacteria like Staphylococcus and Streptococcus. These microbes, introduced from the fingernails or the environment into the open wounds, would rapidly colonize the area, leading to secondary bacterial infections. Conditions such as impetigo, characterized by oozing, crusted sores, and folliculitis, the infection of the hair follicles themselves, would become commonplace. These localized infections could progress to cellulosis, a deeper infection of the skin, or even led to the formation of painful abscesses. Beyond the realm of infestation and infection, the physical structure of the coiffure exerted its own unique form of mechanical damage. The most significant issue, now known as traction alopecia, the completed pouf with its wire frame, heavy padding, and masses of false hair, was an object of considerable weight. This weight was not evenly distributed but was anchored directly to the wearer's natural hair, which was pulled taut and woven into the structure's foundation. This created a constant, unyielding tensile force on the hair follicles, particularly around the hairline and at the crown. The follicles, which are not designed to support such a sustained load, would respond with inflammation. Over time, this chronic tension would physically damage the follicle and its pupilla, the structure responsible for hair growth. The result was progressive hair thinning and, eventually, permanent hair loss. The very hairstyle intended to create an illusion of abundant hair was, in fact, systematically destroying the wearer's natural ability to produce it. Finally, the chemical and environmental conditions of the scalp led to a host of dermatological ailments. The rancid pomatum, in direct contact with the skin for weeks on end, could cause a severe form of contact dermatitis, an allergic or irritant reaction resulting in a red, itchy, and sometimes blistering rash. The occlusive, unventilated environment, trapping sweat and sebum, created ideal conditions for the proliferation of Malassezia yeast, leading to severe seborrheic dermatitis or dandruff. It also provided a perfect breeding ground for fungal infections like Tinea capitis or scalp ringworm, resulting in scaly patches and further hair loss. The scalp of a fashionable 18th century woman was not a healthy organ. It was a chronically diseased tissue, suffering from a multi-front assault of parasitic bites, bacterial and fungal infections, mechanical irritation. The powdered surface was a pristine mask, concealing a medical disaster zone beneath. The preceding catalogue of medical afflictions, the parasitic infestations, the bacterial infections, the chronic pain, and the permanent hair loss presents a rational mind with an unavoidable question. Why? Why would any individual willingly submit to, and pay a fortune for, a daily regimen of physical misery? To dismiss this as mere vanity or a simple desire to be fashionable is to fundamentally misunderstand the brutal, high-stakes environment of the 18th century European court. Infested coiffure was not a frivolous choice. It was a non-negotiable tool for survival in a semiotic landscape where appearance was not an aspect of identity, but its very substance. The physical weight of the hair padding and wire was insignificant when compared to the crushing symbolic weight of the style itself. The aristocratic court, particularly the French court at Versailles, was a closed, competitive, and panoptic system. Every courtier was under the constant, unblinking surveillance of their peers and, most importantly, of the monarch. Social and political not on merit in a modern sense, but on proximity to the king and the successful navigation of an incredibly complex, unwritten code of etiquette, gesture, and appearance. A woman's hairstyle was her primary broadcast medium. It was a public declaration of her family's wealth, her husband's influence, and her own standing in the delicate, ever-shifting hierarchy. A taller, more elaborate, more daringly decorated pouf was a signal of high status, a visual claim to importance. To fall behind in the sartorial arms race was to signal a decline in fortune or favor, an invitation for rivals to sense weakness. This logic was built upon the foundational principle of conspicuous consumption, a term later coined by the sociologist Thorstein Veblen. The very impracticality and biological cost of the hairstyle was central to its value as a status symbol. Its towering height, its delicate ornamentation, and its manifest unsuitably for any form of physical labor were a powerful declaration of pure leisure. It announced to the world that the wearer was so wealthy, so removed from the basic concerns of human existence, that she could afford to transform her head into a delicate, burdensome, and completely useless sculpture. The pain, the itching, the smell, these were not unfortunate side effects to be hidden, but rather integral components of the display. To endure them with grace and composure, to manage the itch with an elegant ivory scratching stick, was to perform one's aristocratic status. It was a demonstration of a refined sensibility, a body so noble it could transcend the squalid realities it was forced to host. The pressure to conform to this standard was absolute. For an aristocratic woman at court, opting out was not an option. It was a form of social suicide. To appear at a formal event with simple, unpowdered, or out-of-date hair would have been a catastrophic breach of protocol. It would not be interpreted as a choice for comfort or a sign of sensible pragmatism, but as an admission of failure. It would suggest that one's family could no longer afford a top-tier coiffure, that one's social connections were so weak that they were no longer aware of the current fashion, or most dangerously, that one was making a deliberate political statement of dissent against the aesthetic standards set by the Queen. The immediate consequence would be ridicule, exclusion from key social circles, and a swift plummet down the social ladder. In the closed ecosystem of the court, to be rendered invisible was a fate worse than any physical discomfort. This created a powerful psychological trap. The immense initial investment of time and money, the hours of painful construction, and the commitment 2 weeks of wear made the hairstyle a significant sunk cost. The woman became a custodian of her own image, a living mannequin for a priceless and perishable work of art. Her entire social identity was bound up in the preservation of this fragile structure. The daily ritual of the toilet, the formal process of dressing and grooming, was a semi-public performance where a lady of status received visitors. The state of her hair was on display, a subject of critique and admiration. She was lost in a cycle of escalating investment and de-escalating anxiety, forced to maintain the painful symbol of her own status, lest its collapse precipitate her own. The biological cost, however severe, was deemed a necessary and subordinate price to pay for remaining a relevant player in the only game that mattered. The immense psychological pressure that compelled European aristocrats to endure these unhygienic structures might suggest that the fusion of elaborate hairstyling with filth was an unavoidable historical constant. This assumption, however, is a product of a Eurocentric perspective. The sacrifice of biological comfort and cleanliness for symbolic status was not a universal law but a specific cultural choice, a result of a particular set of material and technological paths. A comparative analysis of other complex societies from the same period reveals that the European model was an outlier, not the norm. Other cultures which placed an equally profound emphasis on hair as a medium for social and aesthetic expression developed sophisticated traditions that integrated artistry with practical solutions for hygiene. In Edo period Japan 1603–1868, for instance, the hairstyles of women, particularly those of the samurai class, court ladies, and geisha, were marvels of sculptural complexity. Styles like the shimada and its many variations involved intricate arrangements of loops, wings, and buns, held in place with a variety of combs, pins, kanzashi, and waxed cords. The finished coiffure was a work of art, communicating a woman's age, social class, and marital status with a precision that would have been understood by any contemporary observer. At a superficial level, the Japanese practice shared several features with the European one. The style took many hours to create by a skilled professional. It was designed to last for several days, and it used a stiffening agent to hold its shape. Here, however, the material and practical traditions diverged sharply. The primary binding unstyling agent, known as bin-tsuk-a-buro, was not a pomade of rancid, ifying animal fat. It was a wax derived primarily from the Japanese wax tree, often mixed with a base of purified camellia seed oil. This plant-based substance was far more chemically stable, less prone to decomposition, and did not produce the foul odors associated with its European counterpart. While it could still make the hair sticky, it was not an attractive food source for vermin in the same way as beef tallow and flour. The most critical innovation, however, was a simple but ingenious piece of technology designed to solve the problem of preservation. The takomakaka. This was a lacquered wooden pillar, but it did not support the head. Instead, it consisted of a raised base with a small, padded cushion on top, designed to support the neck. A woman sleeping with a takomakaka would rest the base of her neck on the cushion, allowing her entire head and its elaborate hairstyle to be suspended in the air, untouched by the bedding. This single object elegantly solved the primary challenge that plagued European wearers. It prevented the hairstyle from being crushed during sleep, drastically extending its lifespan. Crucially, it also promoted hygiene. By keeping the hair elevated and away from the body and bed linens, it allowed air to circulate, reducing the buildup of heat and moisture at the scalp. It also minimized the transfer of parasites, such as fleas or bed bugs, from the bedding to the hair. The Japanese system therefore allowed for extreme artistry while actively designing for longevity and cleanliness. A similar synthesis of elaborate aesthetics and practical function can be observed in various cultures across the African continent. Among the Himba people of Namibia, for example, hair is a central element of identity, with different styles of braids and coverings denoting one's place in the life cycle. The women are famous for their intricate dreadlocks, which are carefully tended and styled over many years. The crucial element here is the paste used to coat and sculpt the hair, known as haute. It is a mixture of butterfat and finely ground ochre pigment. This red paste bears a superficial resemblance to the European pomatum in that it is a fat-based substance applied liberally to the hair. Yet its function is almost the polar opposite. The ochre is not an inert colorant. It is a type of iron-rich clay that acts as a powerful cleansing agent, absorbing dirt and excess oil. Furthermore, The aromatic herbs often mixed into the paste, combined with the mineral properties of the ochre itself, serve as an effective insect repellent. The jice paste, therefore, is not a substance that fosters infestation, but one that actively prevents it. It is simultaneously a cosmetic, a cleanser, a moisturizer, and a form of protection against the harsh desert sun and parasitic insects. The Himba tradition demonstrates a system where the very material used to create the aesthetic is also the agent of its hygiene. These non-European examples are not exhaustive, but they are definitive. They prove that the squalor of the European coiffure was not an inevitable price for beauty or status. It was the specific outcome of a system that failed to innovate, choosing materials that decayed and offering no technological solution to manage the consequences, even as the absurdity of its own creation became increasingly apparent to observers of the time. The absurdity of the towering, vermin-infested coiffure was not a secret known only to the wearers and their hairdressers. It was a subject of widespread public fascination, ridicule, and sharp social critique. While the participants within the closed system of the court were compelled to treat these creations with the utmost seriousness, observers on the outside and even some dissenting voices within saw them as potent symbols of aristocratic excess and detachment from reality. This critique found its most powerful expression in the burgeoning popular media of the day, particularly in the mass-produced satirical prints and engravings that flourished in cities like London and Paris. These prints, the 18th century equivalent of political cartoons, were cheap to produce, easy to distribute, and their visual language was immediately accessible to a broad audience, both literate and illiterate. For satirists, the pouf was an irresistible target. Its sheer verticality and architectural complexity were a gift to the caricaturist's pen, allowing for endless, grotesque exaggeration. Artists like Matthew Darley and Mary Darley in London became famous for their series of prints mocking the macaronis, the fashionable young men of the era, and their female counterparts. In these images, the hairstyles were stretched to impossible comical proportions, often doubling or tripling the height of the wearer's head. The critique embedded in these caricatures operated on several levels. On the simplest level, they mocked the fashion's sheer impracticality. One famous print depicts a woman whose hair is so tall she cannot fit into her sedan chair, her head poking out through a specially cut hole in the roof. Another shows a lady at dinner, her headdress so high that she is being served by a footman standing on a ladder. These images highlighted the fashion's complete divorce from the functional realities of everyday life, framing its adherents as absurdly out of touch. More pointedly, the satirists seized upon the elaborate ornamentation to make political, unsocial statements. They would exaggerate the thematic decorations to the point of lunacy. A pouf adorned with a warship in a society portrait might be redrawn in a satire to feature an entire naval battle, complete with cannon smoke and drowning sailors. A pastoral hairdo with a few charming lambs could be transformed into a chaotic barnyard scene, complete with pigs and chicken. This technique served to ridicule the triviality of aristocratic concerns, suggesting that while the nation was engaged in serious matters of war, economics, and politics, the elite were littering frivolous fantasies on their head. Crucially, the satirists did not shy away from the squalid reality of the coiffure's ecosystem. The hidden world of parasites became a public joke. It was common to see prints depicting tiny figures, servants, hairdressers, or even chimney sweeps climbing ladders propped against a lady's head to perform maintenance, hunt for vermin, or simply explore the vast, unknown territory. Mice were frequently shown peeking out from behind a curl or nibbling on a decorative piece of fruit. One print explicitly titled "The Head Dress" shows a cross-section of a pouf, revealing a multi-story habitat teeming with lice, fleas, and a family of mice comfortably ensconced in their nest. This was a powerful leveling gesture. The print stripped away the powdered, perfumed veneer of aristocracy to reveal the biological filth beneath, suggesting that for all their claims of refined sensibility and noble blood, these elites were just as subject to the basest realities of vermin and decay as the poorest peasant. This critique was not confined to visual media. Writers and social commentators of the period also took aim. The London Magazine in 1777 published a satirical letter from a distressed husband complaining that his wife's headdress was a fire hazard and had become so infested that he was forced to lay a trap for the mice every night before bed. Such writings, though humorous in tone, served a serious purpose. They reflected a growing sentiment among the rising middle class, or bourgeoisie, who valued pragmatism, reason, and cleanliness. To these observers, the aristocratic hairstyle was a perfect symbol of everything that was wrong with the Ancien Régime. It was irrational, wasteful, decadent, and fundamentally corrupt, both morally and literally. The mountain of rotting hair on a duchess's head became a metaphor for the rotting foundations of the monarchy itself. The laughter it provoked was not entirely good-natured, a growing disrespect for a ruling class that seemed increasingly ridiculous and disconnected. The seeds of revolution were being sown, and the critique of fashion was one of the many ways in which the soil was being tilled. The simmering contempt that had been channeled into satirical prints and witty essays did not remain confined to paper. As the 1782 drew to a close, France was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy and social collapse. The laughter provoked by the caricatures of impossibly tall hair grew harder, colder, and more dangerous. The hairstyle that had been a metaphor for the rotting foundations of the state was about to become a literal target in the violent upheaval that would dismantle that state entirely. When the French Revolution ignited in 1789, the pouf ceased to be a mere object of ridicule. It became a potent and perilous political statement, an unambiguous emblem of the Ancien Régime and all its perceived injustices. In the fevered, paranoid atmosphere of revolutionary Paris, symbols acquired a life-or-death importance. The tricolor cockade was a declaration of loyalty to the new order. The absence of one was a mark of suspicion. In this new and brutal visual lexicon, the towering, powdered coiffure was the ultimate symbol of the enemy. To wear one in public was to openly identify oneself with the aristocracy, a caste that was being rapidly redefined as a parasitic cancer on the body politic. The flour used to powder these creations, once a signifier of conspicuous waste, was now seen as a direct theft of bread from the mouths of the starving masses, the sans culottes. The hairstyle was no longer just out of fashion. It was a political crime, an act of counter-revolutionary defiance that could provoke the fury of a street mob and, eventually, the fatal interest of the Committee of Public Safety. At the heart of this symbolic condemnation was Queen Marie Antoinette. For years she had been the subject of a vicious pamphlet campaign that portrayed her as frivolous, profligate, and a treasonous agent of her native Austria. Her famous, extravagant hairstyles, particularly the towering pouf constructions of her curl, IFFU Alinado tie, had made her the living embodiment of the monarchy's detachment from the suffering of its people. She became the focal point for the nation's rage, and her hair was inseparable from her hated persona. For the women of the aristocracy, who had spent decades emulating her every sartorial whim, this association became a deadly liability. The urgent need for survival dictated a radical and immediate aesthetic transformation. The preservation of one's head now required the complete dismantling of the monument that sat upon it. Thus, the fall of the French monarchy was preceded by the dramatic and violent collapse of its signature hairstyle. What replaced it was not simply a new trend, but a new ideology made manifest in keratin. The revolutionary aesthetic was predicated on a conscious and total rejection of the old order's values. Where the Ancien Régime had celebrated artifice, the Republic championed nature. Where the court had valued complexity, the revolution demanded simplicity. The new ideal was republican virtue, a concept drawn from idealized visions of the Roman and Greek republics, which were believed to be societies of stoic, unadorned, and patriotic citizens. This ideological shift gave rise to a new and starkly different set of hairstyles for women. The most influential was the coiffure en otitis, a radical style featuring short, cropped, and often deliberately disheveled curls. Its inspiration came directly from classical antiquity, mimicking the hairstyles seen on Roman busts of figures like the Emperor Titus. More to the revolutionary point, Lucius Junius Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic. To adopt the Titus cut was a powerful political act. It was a rejection of the soft, hyper-feminized, and decorative aesthetic of the monarchy. It signaled an alignment with the new, supposedly masculine virtues of the Republic. Reason, patriotism, and a classical austerity. It was a visual declaration of a new kind of woman, for a new kind of woman, for a new kind of France. An even more macabre and potent style emerged from the darkest period of the Revolution, the Reign of Terror. This was the coiffure of time. As thousands were sent to the guillotine, a grim ritual preceded their execution. The condemned's hair was crudely sheared at the nape of the neck to ensure a clean cut for the blade. According to some contemporary accounts, women whose relatives had been executed began to adopt this very haircut as a private, subversive symbol of mourning and defiance. They would cut their hair short in the back, often sweeping the longer hair on top forward. This chilling style was sometimes accessorized with a thin red ribbon or choker worn around the neck, a direct and shocking reference to the line of the guillotine's blade. The hairstyle had been transformed into a memorial, a walking monument to the state's victims. The symbolic weight that had once been expressed in vertical feet of powdered pomposity was now located in a single stark and silent line at the back of the neck. The art of the coiffure was no longer dictated by the whims of a queen, but by the shadow of the executioner's blade. The profound political and social trauma of the French Revolution did not remain an internal French affair. Its shockwaves radiated across Europe, and with them, a new aesthetic order. Architectural coiffure in Paris signaled a definitive end to an era. The neoclassical ideal, born in the radical crucible of the Republic, was swiftly adopted and adapted by the very monarchies and aristocracies that had once defined themselves in opposition to it. Continent-wide adoption was not merely a matter of changing tastes. It was a strategic rebranding, a conscious effort by the ruling classes to distance themselves from the dangerous symbolism of the old regime. The aesthetic that emerged was a direct and deliberate inversion of everything the pouf had represented. Where the old style was defined by towering height, the new style emphasized a low, natural profile. Where the Ancien Régime celebrated artifice and complexity, the new ideal, known as the Empire style in Napoleonic France or the Regency style in Britain, championed an image of classical simplicity and naturalness. The primary inspiration was no longer the gilded salons of Versailles, but the windswept ruins of Athens and the newly excavated frescoes of Pompeii. The ideal woman was no longer a delicate, porcelain doll-like figure, but a Grecian goddess or a Roman matron, her beauty defined by clean lines, flowing fabrics, and, most importantly, unadorned hair. The new hairstyles, with names like a log rake or a la romaine, were characterized by a soft, almost casual elegance. The hair was typically parted in the center and drawn back from the face into a simple knot, bun, or coil at the nape of the neck or the crown of the head, a style known as a chign or a psyche knot. The severe, rigidly curled coiffures of the past were replaced by loose, romantic tendrils and soft tringles that were allowed to escape and frame the face. The goal was to achieve an appearance of effortless grace, as if the wearer had just stepped away from an artist's easel or a philosophical discussion in an ancient garden. The stylistic revolution had profound biological consequences. The foundational principle look was the celebration of the hair's own natural texture and color. This meant the immediate and total abandonment of the two pillars of the previous century's unhygienic practices, pomatum and powder. Without the need to construct gravity-defying sculptures, the greasy, adhesive pomatum became obsolete. Without the art of starch-based powder vanished. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the hair of the European elite was allowed to be itself clean, soft, and unburdened. The disappearance of these materials fundamentally altered the scalp's ecosystem. The removal of the rancid ifying animal fat and the edible flour eliminated the primary food source and the welcoming poultry that had sustained the parasitic populations. The new styles, which were open, airy, and close to the head, did not provide the dark, warm, and sheltered habitat required by lice and fleas to thrive. Furthermore, the very nature of the hairstyles, simple, unbound, and made from the wearer's own hair, meant that they could be, and were expected to be, washed. The concept of regular hair washing, a practice that had been a logistical and structural impossibility for the wearers of a pouf, became a new marker of refinement. This new emphasis on cleanliness was part of a broader cultural shift. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw a growing interest in personal hygiene, influenced by Enlightenment ideas about reason, nature, and the scientific understanding of the human body. The clean, natural body was seen as a reflection of a clear, rational mind. The perfumed powdered artifice of the Ancien Régime was now viewed as a form of dishonest and unhealthy concealment. To be clean was to be modern, enlightened, and virtuous. This return to simplicity was, in its own way, as profound a statement of status as the towering coiffure had been. It signaled an alignment with the new values of a new century, a world that was beginning to value the visible evidence of hygiene over the conspicuous display of wealth. The scratching stick was laid aside, replaced by the comb and the brush, not as tools of management, but as instruments of a new and revolutionary ideal. The neoclassical return to simplicity, driven by the ideological upheaval of the French Revolution, was the initial death knell for the unhygienic architectural hairstyles of the past. It was, however, a revolution in philosophy and aesthetics. Not yet one of material realization of these practices required a different kind of revolution, one waged not in the political salons and on the battlefields, but in the laboratories, factories, and municipal waterworks of the 19th century. This was the sanitation revolution, a profound transformation in the Western world's relationship with dirt, disease, and the human body, which provided the scientific reasoning and the industrial means to make cleanliness a universal, achievable, and morally imperative virtue. The first pillar of this revolution was a radical new understanding of disease. For centuries, the prevailing explanation for illness was the miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air or noxious vapors emanating from rotting organic matter. While this theory did encourage a certain level of public sanitation, such as the removal of waste to improve the smell of a city, it was fundamentally incorrect. The true breakthrough came in the latter half of the 19th century with the development of the germ theory of disease, pioneered by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Their work demonstrated that many diseases were caused not by bad smells, but by specific, living microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, and fungi. This discovery was nothing short of a paradigm shift. It transformed the concept of dirt from an aesthetic problem into a medical one. Dirt was no longer just unsightly or foul-smelling. It was a potential reservoir for invisible, life-threatening pathogens. This new scientific knowledge had immediate and profound implications for personal hygiene. The unwashed, pomatum-clogged scalp, once viewed merely as a source of odor and a habitat for visible parasites like lice, was now recontextualized through a microscope. It was a perfect culture medium, a warm, moist, nutrient-rich environment for the proliferation of pathogenic microbial life. Joseph Lister's work on antiseptic surgery, which involved killing germs to prevent infection, further reinforced the idea that the human skin was a battleground. Cleanliness was no longer a matter of class or refinement. It was a matter of life and death, a crucial line of defense against an unseen enemy. The vague Enlightenment ideal of a natural and clean body was now armed with a powerful scientific mandate. The second pillar of the revolution was industrial. The new desire for cleanliness could not have been realized without the means to achieve it. The Industrial Revolution provided this. The key commodity was soap. For centuries, soap had been a luxury good, produced on a small scale through the saponification of animal fats with lye derived from wood ash. It was often harsh, expensive, and inconsistent. The 19th century changed this entirely. Most notably, the Leblanc process, invented in the late 18th century but widely adopted in the 19th, allowed for the mass production of soda ash, a key ingredient for soap making. This, combined with the mechanization of factories, turned soap from a costly artisanal product into a cheap, standardized, and universally available commodity. Brands like Pears and Ever Brothers marketed soap not just as a cleanser, but as an agent of health, moral uplift, and social progress. Regular washing of the body and hair was economically accessible to the rapidly growing middle and working classes. The third and final pillar was infrastructural. The scientific imperative for washing and the industrial production of soap were meaningless without access to the most basic ingredient: clean water. The great Victorian engineering projects of the mid to late 19th century fundamentally replumbed the urban landscape. Cities like London and Paris invested enormous sums in the construction of massive public works, aqueducts to bring fresh water in, and complex sewer systems to carry wastewater away. This gradually led to the introduction of indoor plumbing in affluent and middle-class homes. The laborious, servant-intensive process of hauling and heating water, which had made frequent washing an impossibility in the previous century, was slowly replaced by the simple turning of a tap. This trinity of science, industry, and infrastructure formed an iron cage from which the old styles could never escape. The elaborate, unwashed coiffures of the Ancien Régime were now viewed through a new, unforgiving lens. They were not just politically tainted and aesthetically absurd. They were scientifically dangerous, a relic of a primitive, ignorant, and lethally unsanitary age. And regularly washed hair of the Victorian woman became the new, potent symbol of status that is defined not by the ability to waste flour, but by an enlightened understanding of germ theory and access to the modern miracle of a hot bath. The sanitation revolution of the 19th century did not eliminate the human desire for elaborate hairstyling or the symbolic power of hair. It did, however, permanently sever the link between complexity and squalor. The Victorian era, with its emphasis on domesticity, propriety, and a highly codified social life, saw the return of intricate coiffures. Styles became increasingly complex throughout the century, featuring elaborate braids, heavy coils, and waterfalls of sausage curls. Yet, these creations were fundamentally different from their 18th century predecessors. They were built upon a new foundation of cleanliness, and they were designed to coexist with the new, non-negotiable standards of personal hygiene. The primary innovation that made this possible was the reconstitution piece and technological refinement of the wig and its smaller cousin, the hairpiece. The 18th century wig, and the semi-permanent pouf, which was effectively a wig constructed in situ, was an integrated, long-term installation. It was meant to be lived in, slept in, and endured for weeks at a time. The Victorian approach was entirely different. The wig, now more commonly referred to as a transformation or a post-dyke, was redefined as a detachable accessory, an object to be worn for a specific occasion and removed at the end of the day. This was a return to the pragmatic of the ancient Egyptians, but with the benefit of 19th century manufacturing techniques. This single change from a semi-permanent fixture to a temporary adornment resolved the central hygiene conflict that had plagued the earlier era. The technological advancements in wig making were significant. The crude wire frames and coarse padding of the pouf were replaced by much lighter, more sophisticated foundations. Wig makers developed the technique of ventilating, a painstaking process where individual strands of hair were knotted by hand into a fine, flexible mesh cap made of silk, lace, or gauze. This created a wig that was significantly lighter, more breathable, and conformed far more closely to the shape of the head than its predecessors. The fit was so precise, and the hairline so natural, that a well-made wig could be virtually indistinguishable from real hair. This allowed a woman to present a public image of impossibly thick, perfectly coiffed hair, while her own natural hair remained clean and healthy beneath. More common than the full wig was the use of smaller modular hairpieces. These included switches, long wefts of hair that could be braided or coiled, curls, pre-styled ringlets that could be pinned into place, and frisettes, small, fluffy pads of hair or wool worn under the natural hair to create volume. These pieces allowed a woman to augment her own hair, achieving the fashionable, voluminous silhouettes of the mid to late Victorian period without resorting to the unhygienic practices of the past. A woman could have her own hair washed and styled, and then a hairdresser would artfully integrate these pre-prepared switches and curls to build the final, elaborate structure. At the end of the evening, the process was simply reversed. The hairpieces were removed, brushed, and stored in boxes, and the woman's own hair could be brushed out and prepared for sleep. This modular approach had profound hygienic benefits. The woman's own scalp and hair could be washed regularly, preventing the buildup of oils and the establishment of parasitic colonies. The detachable hairpieces themselves could also be cleaned, though this was a delicate process. They were typically cleaned not with water, but with dry, absorbent powders like bran or cornmeal, which were brushed through to absorb grease and dirt, or with solvents like benzene or alcohol, a process that required great care due to their extreme flammability. This system of compartmentalized hygiene, regularly washing the real hair, periodically cleaning the false components, made the grand, complex hairstyle compatible with the new medical understanding of cleanliness. The wig and the hairpiece thus became tools of efficient, sanitary illusion. They allowed for the public performance of a highly complex and time-consuming aesthetic, without the private misery and biological decay that had previously been its price. The scratching stick became an obsolete curiosity, an artifact from a less enlightened age. The fine-tooth comb remained, but its role was now preventative, used on clean hair to catch all infestation before it could take hold. The ultimate symbol of status was no longer the entrance of a filthy, permanent crown, but the ability to afford a high-quality, perfectly matched, an utterly detachable one. The horror of the infested headdress was not forgotten. It was solved, relegated to the past by a combination of new technology and a new, deeply ingrained ideology of sanitation. The hygienic and technological solutions of the 19th century effectively dismantled the specific ecological niche of the aristocratic coiffure, the fortress of pomatum and powder, which had served as the parasite's grandest palace, was razed. This victory, however, was over a particular habitat, not over the inhabitant itself. The human head louse, Pedicudus humanus capitis, was not an artifact of the Ancien Régime. It is an obligate human parasite, an organism whose evolutionary history is inextricably bound to that of its host. The demise of the pouf did not lead to its extinction. It merely dispossessed it, forcing it to persist in less spectacular, more democratic circumstances. The modern world still hears the echo of this ancient scourge, but the sound it makes has been profoundly altered by a complete inversion of its social meaning. The most significant transformation was the stripping away of its former class connotations. In the 18th century, a louse infestation was an unfortunate but largely unavoidable aspect of the human condition, a cross-class phenomenon that afflicted the peasant and the prince alike. The difference lay not in its presence, but in its management. An aristocrat managed the problem with expensive perfumes, powders, and ornate ivory scratching sticks, transforming the endurance of the infestation into a performance of high-status nonchalance. For the poor, the same problem was managed with harsh lye soaps, fine-tipped wooden combs, and stoic resignation. The parasite was a biological universal. In the 20th and 21st centuries, following the sanitation revolution, this universality was shattered. The new baseline expectation, made possible by mass-produced soaps, pharmaceuticals, and indoor plumbing, became one of total cleanliness. The absence of parasites became the new norm. Consequently, the presence of lice underwent a radical social reclassification. It ceased to be an unfortunate universal and became a marker of a specific, localized failure of that new norm. Infestation became deeply stigmatized, incorrectly but powerfully associated with poverty, neglect, or a lack of personal hygiene. This created a new psychological burden that the 18th century aristocrat, for all her physical suffering, never had to bear. The modern echo of the itch is now accompanied by a potent sense of social anxiety and a desperate need for concealment. The parasite, deprived of the static, long-term habitat of the powdered coiffure, adapted by thriving in environments that maximized its primary mode of transmission, direct head-to-head contact. The new epicenter of pediculosis became not the royal court, but the elementary school, the daycare center, and the summer camp. These institutions, designed for the communal education and socialization of children, inadvertently created the perfect transmission vector. Physical nature of children's play, huddling over a book, sharing secrets, wrestling on the playground, provided the louse with a simple, efficient bridge from one host to another. The battle against the infestation also transformed, moving from the private boudoir to the clinical and institutional realm. The court coiffeur, with his toxic mercury powders and delicate cones, was replaced by a new figure, the school nurse. The response to an outbreak became a modern, systemated ritual. Official notices printed on colored paper are sent home in backpacks, their language a calm but firm call to arms. The fine-toothed delicizing cone, now mass-produced in plastic or stainless steel, re-emerged as the primary tool of eradication, its design virtually unchanged in its function for millennia. This manual removal is now augmented by a chemical arsenal of over-the-counter, pediculicide shampoos and lotions containing neurotoxins like permethrin or pyrethrins, designed to poison the lice and their eggs. The private, Messy reality of this process: the long hours spent meticulously combing through a child's hair under a bright light. The laundering of all bedding and clothing has become a shared, if seldom discussed, rite of passage for modern parents. This modern battle, however, has become its own kind of evolutionary arms race. Just as bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics, populations of head lice have, through natural selection, developed significant resistance to the most commonly used chemical treatments. A louse with a genetic mutation that allows it to survive a dose of permethrin will reproduce, passing that resistance on to its offspring. The result is the emergence of super lice, strains that are unfazed by the standard chemical arsenal, forcing a return to more laborious manual removal methods or the development of new, more potent chemical agents. The parasite continues to adapt. Thus, the louse persists, the tiny tenacious ghost of a less cemetery age. It is the same organism that crawled in the wigs of pharaohs, nested in the veils of medieval ladies, and feasted on the scalps of duchesses at Versailles. But its symbolic weight has been entirely recalibrated. It is no longer an accepted, if irritating, cohabitant of a static, filthy crown. It is a furtive, stigmatized fugitive, a biological anachronism that triggers a uniquely modern form of social panic, a testament to how profoundly our relationship with the microscopic world has changed, and a reminder that the complete separation of our bodies from the wider biological ecosystem is an illusion that is never fully achieved. The long historical arc from the sacred long-haired kings of the Merovingian to the modern, medicalized battle against a schoolchild's head lice reveals a narrative that is far more complex than a simple linear progression from dirt to cleanliness. It describes the evolution of a fundamental tension, a persistent and often paradoxical conflict between the symbolic aspirations of a culture and the immutable biological realities of the human body. The story of the infested crown is not, in the end, a story about lice or fat or flour. It is a case study in the high, and sometimes brutal, cost of using the human form as a canvas for the projection of power, status, and identity. Throughout this chronicle, we have seen the human head transformed into a succession of potent symbols. For the early Franks, it was a living emblem of virility and divine right, a biological crown whose violation was tantamount to treason. For the medieval woman, it was a site of dangerous sensuality to be contained and concealed, its covering a public performance of piety and subordination. In the Renaissance and Baroque courts, it became a stage for theatrical displays of wealth, an architectural platform upon which status could be constructed and displayed. For the revolutionaries, it was a political billboard, its style a declaration of allegiance to a new and brutal ideological order. And for the Victorians, it became a testament to a new faith in science and sanitation. Its cleanliness a marker of enlightened modernity. In every era, the hair was made to speak a language that was not its own, a silent, symbolic vocabulary dictated by the prevailing anxieties and ambitions of the time. The biological cost of this symbolism has been a consistent through line of this history. This cost was paid in the currency of chronic pain, disease, and physical misery. It was the price of wearing lead-based powders that poisoned the system, of binding the hair so tightly that it fell out, of building structures so heavy they induced constant headaches. Most viscerally, it was the cost of creating and maintaining a warm, dark, and festering habitat for decay and parasitic life, a choice that necessitated the endurance of a perpetual maddening itch. The ornate scratching stick of the 18th century court stands as the most poignant artifact of this transactional luxury object designed to manage the miserable consequences of a luxury ideal. It is the perfect symbol of a culture's attempt to elegantly coexist with a problem of its own magnificent, ungigantic creation. The ultimate lesson, therefore, is one of biology's quiet insistence. Culture may propose, but biology ultimately disposes. The attempt to create a static, perfect, unchanging monument on a living human head was always doomed to fail. The body is not a stable marble pedestal. It is a dynamic, organic system. It sweats, it sheds skin, it produces oils, it radiates heat, and it exists as part of a larger ecosystem that is teeming with other organisms seeking sustenance and shelter. The project of the pouf was, in essence, an attempt to deny this reality, to create a sterile, permanent artifice on a foundation that was inherently impermanent and biologically active. The resulting infestation was not a bizarre accident, but an inevitable ecological succession. Nature, in the form of microbes and insects, simply moved in to reclaim and decompose the artificial structure that had been imposed upon it. This tension has not vanished from the modern world. While we no longer build vermin-infested towers on our heads, we continue to engage in a complex and often painful dialogue between our biological selves and our symbolic aspirations. We alter our bodies with surgery, subject our skin to chemical and light-based treatments, and endure restrictive diets, all in the pursuit of an aesthetic or social ideal. The specific practices change, the technologies evolve, and the desired symbols are recalibrated for a new era, but the fundamental pattern persists. We continue to ask our bodies to bear the weight of our identities, to serve as the primary text in which we write the story of who we are or who we wish to be. The infested crown may be a relic of the past, but the enduring human impulse to sacrifice physical comfort for symbolic meaning remains a powerful and defining feature of our species. And so that chapter of human darkness closed, but history has a habit of rhyming. Watch for the patterns in your own time. The account is now finished.